Hey there. So it is 1:30 in the morning. I have come home from an incredibly stressful day, one of my worst days in memory. So what a great time it is to start a video on the difference between tragedy and comedy. And this video is going to be a little awkwardly lengthed and paced because I have to split it into two parts, because if I did not, it would be way too long. So we're going to start mainly by talking about comedies this week. And before we even start really talking about comedies, I think we have to talk about protagonists and antagonists. Now, put simply, the protagonist is the hero of your story, and the antagonist is the villain of your story. Now, it's not always this cut and dry. You do have things called villainous protagonists. You have heroic antagonists. Comes in many different forms. You can do all sorts of different like alliances and moral compass sort of things with your protagonist and your antagonist. So I'm going to define these terms a bit further into detail. But first, one distinction I want to make, because it is a pretty common pitfall, especially when talking analysis of storytelling, which is where I'm coming from with this series mainly, but also helps with creative if you're writing an outline and plotting things. The protagonist of your story does not have to be your main character. Oftentimes, the protagonist and the main character will be the same person in your story, but it's not necessary. The difference is that the main character, who here is Nick Carraway from The Great Gatsby, is the eyes into the story. It is how we experience the story. It is the character through whose experience we get into the story. So with The Great Gatsby, it's Nick Carraway. Nick Carraway is our main character. He is our audience surrogate, so to speak. But our protagonist is Jay Gatsby over here. And you can tell who a protagonist is because it is the protagonist who's pursuing the goal of the story. The protagonist is the one whose motivations drive the plot of the story, or are the main focus of the story. And we will talk about character motivations in another week, because that is another kind of complex, deep thing to get into. But right now, all you need to know is the main character is the eyes, the protagonist is the soul. It is what they want that drives the story. And typically, you know a protagonist because you end up rooting for them. You want the protagonist to achieve their goal. Now, this gets a little complicated, and we'll talk about that when we start talking about tragedy, but because we're sticking to comedy this week, and in comedy, you want the protagonist to achieve their goal, and their goal drives the main plot of the story. And that's how you know who your protagonist is. Now, who is your antagonist? Trick question, because your antagonist does not always have to be a who. The antagonist is anything that gets in the protagonist's way. It is anything that gets in the way of the protagonist achieving their goal and fulfilling their motivation. And they come in all sorts of different shapes and sizes and forms and everything like that. So the four classical antagonists are a person, a villain, top hat, mustache, kind of the evil villain guy, the Lex Luthor to your Superman, the Joker to your Batman. You have nature, which is classically, and by classically I mean Greek, nature and gods are the same thing. They are the primordial forces of Earth. So the typical man versus nature story, or protagonist versus nature story, is the Odyssey. It is a man on a boat in the ocean, and you have Poseidon, and you have a bunch of kind of Greek religious stuff there, but it is man versus nature. It is man overcoming their world, their natural world we are born into. Whether that's Earth or an alien planet, doesn't really matter. Depends on your story. But it is man versus the world they are born onto or on right now. You have man versus society. And the reason I'm saying man versus is because that's typically just the nomenclature when talking about analysis and storytelling and stuff, is man versus, because men are typically main characters and have been for thousands of years now. So, sorry, but we have man versus society, which is kind of like man versus nature, but it's human. It's man versus culture. It is one man versus many people, versus their society, versus the popular way of thinking. So you have stories like, borrowing from real life, you have the civil rights movement. You have Martin Luther King Jr. versus racist white America, and that is man versus society. That is one man versus, or one group. It doesn't always have to be one character. Typically, we'll have one main protagonist, and you know who your main protagonist is because they have the hardest goal, or they accomplish, in a comedy, they accomplish the biggest task. But you can have a group of heroes versus society, which is an even bigger group, which is something very cultural, an axiomatic way of thought that they are going up against. And then you have man versus self, which is more, you see this more in tragedies, and we'll get into that again next week when we really talk about tragedies. But man versus self, another classical antagonist, is the self, the dark side, the weakness within a person. If you want to get a little more complicated, you can get into the romantic notion, and by romantic I mean literary romantic, not like lovey-dovey romantic, but the romantic notion of man versus history, the sins of the father approach, and the sins of the father, which is what the past has done, the evils of the past, essentially. So if you're looking at American romanticism, the sin of the past is either genocide of Native Americans or the slave trade. And those create an evil that permeates the land, which kind of creates a man versus nature thing, but it is humans acting on nature, doing an evil upon other people that goes forward. So poltergeists, ancient Indian burial grounds, those are kind of romantic antagonists. Going forward a bit, you have the modern antagonist. And again, modern in the literary sense, not modern as in the today. But the modern antagonist is technology. It is humans dehumanizing their world, making it less natural. And it doesn't always have to be a robot. It doesn't have to be a Terminator story. It could be something like Frankenstein, which is science overstepping natural limits. It could be something like Bartleby the Scrivener, which is man automating oneself in a way, and a man reducing themselves to a task, to a robotic task. And then your antagonist is technology, or man versus machine, as it typically is. And if you want to go postmodern, your antagonist is the medium. So if you're working in film, the antagonist could be the fourth wall of the film. It could be rewinding and fast forwarding. If you're working in books, the words themselves are the enemies, are the things that the protagonist has to overcome in order to win. In a comic book, it's the borders, and they're banging against the edges of the panel, trying to move forward. And so that is man versus medium, which is very postmodern. So now we are going to move to the typical shape of a comedy, which I have drawn on this graph here. Y-axis is happiness, x-axis is time. So at the beginning of the story, you have our protagonist, who is not quite average happy. He wants something more. There is a motivation driving the protagonist, which again drives the plot of the story. And through the plot, we have the protagonist run into the antagonist, and the antagonist beats him down, gets in his way, gets in the way of his happiness, stops him, makes him lose all hope, and then by the climax of your story, also known as the climax of the story in the comedy, the protagonist is at their lowest point. The antagonist is too great, too powerful, and the protagonist loses everything, or so it seems, because a comedic ending means that the hero wins. The hero overcomes their villain. The protagonist overcomes the antagonist and is way happier at the end of the story than they are at the beginning. And comedy doesn't always mean ha ha ha. A comedy is just any story where you begin with the character not happy and end with them happy. Typically, this means that the protagonist has achieved their motivation. they have found the thing they are looking for, whether it's romance, if it's money, if it's power, if it's beating the bad guy. Whatever they want, typically by the end of the comedy, they have achieved. But that's not always the case, because in the words of the immortal Rolling Stones, you can't always get what you want, but if you try sometimes, you just might find you get what you need. And that's how you know you have a comedy. Not necessarily when the character gets what they want, but when the character gets what they need to be happy. So in a romantic comedy, they might not get the girl they wanted in the beginning. They might not get the hot blonde cheerleader or whatever, but they get someone they can actually love, and they get someone who loves them back. They get someone that improves their lives. Remember, for a story to be a comedy, the protagonist just has to be better off than we found him. That's really it. That's how you tell a comedy. Now, tragedy is a lot more complicated because of reasons we will get into next week when I break down how to tell a tragedy in storytelling. So, see you next week for that, but I hope you enjoyed learning a bit more about comedies, learning a bit more about protagonists and antagonists, and we'll get into motivation, which is very important to the protagonist and to the antagonist. We'll get into motivations in a later week, maybe the week after we discuss tragedy, but I hope you learned something today about comedies, about storytelling in general. If you have any suggestions of things you want me to go into further detail in, because this is still kind of surface level stuff, feel free to leave them in the comments and I will try and get to them and explain them. Otherwise, thank you for watching, and I hope that you join me for stuff like this next week, or start watching my reviews or whatever. You know, it's your life. You choose what to do with it. But thank you for watching.